I stared at the small wooden cabin in front of me, my hands trembling as I gripped the keys Quinn had handed me with all the warmth of someone passing along junk mail. The structure looked decent enough, but after seeing the photos of the sprawling $200,000 ranch he'd bought for his mother-in-law just 2 months ago, this felt like a slap in the face wrapped in cheap ribbon. "Happy 66th birthday, Mom," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the pine trees surrounding the property. The note he'd left with the keys still burned in my pocket. "Sorry, Mom. I'm busy. Hope you like it. Quinn. Busy." That single word had been his excuse for missing my birthday dinner, for not calling, for treating me like an afterthought in his increasingly complicated life. But he wasn't too busy to spend an entire weekend helping his mother-in-law, Sandra, move into her new ranch complete with a wraparound porch, guest house, and horse stables. I'd seen the photos on Facebook before Sandra blocked me. Quinn had been beaming in every single picture, his arm around her shoulders like she was the mother he'd always wanted. I fumbled with the lock, my arthritic fingers making the simple task more difficult than it should have been. The door finally opened with a groan, revealing a modest interior that smelled of fresh paint and artificial pine air freshener. It was clean, I'll give him that. Basic furniture, a small kitchenette, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. Functional, forgettable. My chest tightened as I set my purse down on the small dining table. This was what 38 years of motherhood had earned me. A $30,000 cabin that felt more like a consolation prize than a gift from a son who'd become a millionaire thanks to the sacrifices I'd made raising him alone. I walked to the window overlooking the small backyard, memories flooding back against my will. Quinn at 8 years old, crying because the other kids made fun of his secondhand clothes. Me working double shifts at the diner to buy him new sneakers, going without lunch for a week to afford them. Quinn at 16, desperate to go on the senior trip to Europe. Me taking out a second mortgage on our tiny house, telling him it was no problem even as I wondered how I'd make the payments. Quinn at 22, graduating from business school debt-free because I'd worked myself to the bone to pay his tuition. I remembered standing in that crowd of proud parents, my uniform still smelling like French fries because I'd come straight from my shift, watching him accept his diploma. He'd looked right at me and mouthed, "Thank you, Mom." For one perfect moment, all the sacrifice had felt worth it. When did that grateful young man turn into someone who could drop off cabin keys like he was doing me some enormous favor? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our recent text exchanges. They were depressingly brief. My attempts at conversation met with one-word responses or, more often, nothing at all. Meanwhile, his social media was full of family dinners with Sandra, weekend trips with his wife Monica, elaborate birthday celebrations for everyone except me. The comparison wasn't lost on me. Sandra's ranch had cost 6 times more than my cabin. She got a personal tour from Quinn, help moving in, a weekend celebration with the whole family. I got keys dropped off like a pizza delivery, and a note that took less than 10 seconds to write. I sank into the small armchair facing the window, exhaustion settling into my bones. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny accusations. When had I become so disposable to my own son? My phone buzzed. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe Quinn was calling to explain, to apologize, to tell me there was more to this gift than met the eye. Instead, it was a text from my neighbor asking if I needed help cleaning out my old house now that I had somewhere else to live. The assumption stung. Everyone expected me to be grateful for this modest cabin, to downsize my life and expectations along with it. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe I should be thankful that Quinn remembered my birthday at all. But as I sat there in the growing shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Quinn had always been careful with money, even as a child, but he'd never been cruel. The Quinn I'd raised would have called to explain the gift. would have at least pretended to care about my reaction. This version of my son felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after the long drive. I might as well explore what I'd been given, modest as it was. The bedroom was small, but clean, with a window facing the woods. The bathroom had been recently updated. The kitchen was tiny, but functional. All perfectly adequate for an old woman who should know her place. As I opened cabinets and drawers, checking what came with the place, I found myself wondering about the math that didn't quite add up. Quinn claimed his business was struggling, that money was tight, that he couldn't help with my mounting medical bills. Yet somehow, he'd managed to buy both this cabin and Sandra's ranch in the same year. Either his business had suddenly recovered, or he'd been lying about his financial situation. Standing in that empty cabin, surrounded by the scent of fresh paint and broken promises, I felt something shift inside me. The grateful mother who'd spent decades making excuses for her son's behavior was getting tired. The woman who'd worked herself half to death to give him every opportunity was starting to ask uncomfortable questions that maybe I should have asked years ago. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the small backyard. Tomorrow, I'd start settling into my new life in this cabin that felt more like exile than gift. But tonight, I sat in the growing darkness and wondered when exactly I'd stopped being Quinn's mother and started being his burden. What I didn't know yet was that the answers I was looking for were buried just outside my window, waiting to turn my world upside down. 3 days into living in the cabin, I'd settled into a routine that felt like playing house in someone else's life. Coffee at sunrise, walks in the small garden, evenings reading by the window. It was peaceful in a hollow way, like being wrapped in cotton wool, safe, but suffocating. I was organizing the bedroom closet when I noticed something odd. The back wall seemed shorter than it should be, given the cabin's exterior dimensions. When I pressed against what looked like solid wood paneling, it gave slightly, revealing a hidden compartment behind a loose board. My heart hammered as I worked the board free. Inside was a dusty cardboard box, the kind used for storing important documents. The label on top was written in my late husband Robert's careful handwriting. For Blanche. Life insurance. Open only if something happens to me. My hands shook as I lifted the box. Robert had died 15 years ago, and I thought I'd handled all his affairs back then. Quinn had been so helpful during that terrible time, taking care of all the paperwork while I was drowning in grief. He'd told me there was no life insurance, that Robert hadn't been able to afford the premiums in his final years. Inside the box were documents that made my blood run cold. A life insurance policy for $450,000, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. Payment records showing premiums faithfully paid right up until Robert's death. And most damning of all, correspondence between the insurance company and Quinn, dated just 3 weeks after the funeral. I read the letters with growing horror. Quinn had contacted the company claiming to act on my behalf as my financial advisor. He'd provided them with a signed document, supposedly from me, authorizing him to handle the claim. The signature looked like mine, but I had no memory of signing anything like that. The payout had gone directly into an account Quinn had set up for my protection, because I was too emotionally unstable to handle such a large sum responsibly. The letters referenced my supposed request to have the money invested long-term, with Quinn managing it until I was ready to access it. I'd never made any such request. I'd never even known about the money. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the small bedroom chair, clutching the papers. 15 years ago, when I was struggling to pay for Robert's funeral, working 3 part-time jobs just to keep our tiny house, my son had been sitting on nearly $500,000 of my money. Money that was legally, morally, completely mine. I thought back to those dark months after Robert's death, Quinn had been so attentive, so concerned about my finances. He'd insisted on helping me budget, had taken over paying my bills because I was too scattered to handle it properly. Every time I'd worried about money, he'd assured me we'd figure something out, that he'd help however he could, all while sitting on a fortune that belonged to me. The next document made my stomach lurch, an investment statement showing that my money had indeed been invested and had grown to over $800,000 over the past 15 years. But the account wasn't in my name. It was in Quinn's, listed as a family trust that gave him complete control over the funds. My grief-stricken signature on that authorization letter had essentially given him power of attorney over money I didn't even know existed. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through every document in the box. There were bank statements, investment reports, even correspondence with a financial advisor who believed he was managing a fund for a wealthy client who wanted to provide for his elderly mother when she was ready to retire. Quinn had been telling people I was some kind of invalid who needed his protection and guidance. Meanwhile, I'd been scraping by on Social Security and small savings, occasionally asking him for help with unexpected expenses, help he'd grudgingly provided while making me feel guilty for needing it. The last document in the box was a handwritten letter from Robert to me. My vision blurred with tears as I read his familiar scrawl. My darling Blanche, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I know you worry about money, so I want you to know I've provided for you. The life insurance will give you security, maybe even let you travel like we always planned. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't handle your own affairs. You're the strongest person I know, and this money is yours by right. Live the life we dreamed of, sweetheart. You deserve every happiness. All my love, Robert. I pressed the letter to my chest and sobbed. Not just for Robert, though I missed him every day, but for the 15 years I'd lost. 15 years of worrying about money, of working jobs that wore my body down, of feeling like a burden on my successful son. 15 years of a life I could have lived with dignity and comfort if I'd known about the resources that were rightfully mine. The worst part was remembering all the times I'd thanked Quinn for his help, all the times I'd apologized for being a financial burden. He'd sat there, accepting my gratitude and my guilt, knowing he was controlling money that could have changed everything for me. As the sun set outside the cabin window, I realized that the modest gift of this place took on an entirely different meaning. This wasn't generosity. This was management. Quinn had parked me here, away from his real life, in a place he could control. The cabin probably cost him less than he spent on Sandra's monthly allowance, and it came with the bonus of keeping me occupied and out of his hair. I looked around the small space with new eyes. It wasn't a retirement retreat. It was a warehouse for an inconvenient mother, furnished just well enough to prevent accusations of neglect. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. No calls from Quinn checking if I'd settled in okay. No texts asking if I needed anything. Why would there be? In his mind, he'd solved the Blanche problem by giving me a place to quietly exist while he lived his real life with people who mattered. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the darkening woods. Somewhere out there, Sandra was probably hosting another family dinner in her sprawling ranch, surrounded by Quinn and Monica and their children. My grandchildren, who barely knew I existed. She'd probably tell stories about her wonderful son-in-law who was so generous and thoughtful, while I sat in my cabin like some forgotten relic. But I wasn't forgotten. I was controlled, and for the first time in 15 years, I knew exactly how and why. The question now was what I was going to do about it. I spent the next morning at the local library, learning how to use their computers to research what Quinn had done with my money. What I discovered made me physically ill. The investment account wasn't just sitting there growing quietly. Quinn had been actively using it. Large withdrawals for family expenses, that coincided with major purchases I'd seen on social media. The down payment for his house, Monica's luxury car, even the children's private school tuition was being paid from what was supposed to be my nest egg. But it was the email correspondence I found that truly broke my heart. I'd managed to access some old email accounts Robert had set up years ago, accounts that had been forwarding financial statements to Quinn. Hidden in the spam folder were dozens of messages between Quinn and Monica that painted a picture of me I barely recognized. Monica had written, "Your mother called again asking for help with her electric bill. How much longer do we have to keep up this charade? She's so needy and honestly kind of pathetic." Quinn's response, "I know, but we have to be careful. If she ever finds out about the insurance money, we're screwed. I'll send her $200 and tell her it's all I can manage right now. She'll feel guilty for asking for more." Another exchange from just last month. Monica. She sent another birthday card for Emma with $20 inside. "It's embarrassing. I threw it away before Emma could see it. The last thing we need is our kids thinking poverty is normal." Quinn. "Good call. I've been thinking we need to create more distance. The cabin was a good start. Maybe we can limit visits to holidays only. That way the kids won't get too attached to someone who's basically living hand to mouth." Monica. "Smart. Though honestly, with her health issues, how much longer do we have to deal with this? She's what, 66? That insurance money should be ours anyway. We're the ones raising the kids and building something with our lives." I sat in that quiet library, surrounded by the gentle sounds of pages turning and keyboards clicking, and felt my world collapse entirely. They weren't just stealing my money, they were erasing me from my grandchildren's lives because they were ashamed of who they thought I was. My hands trembled as I continued reading. There were discussions about my deteriorating mental state that bore no resemblance to reality. Monica had convinced Quinn that I was showing early signs of dementia, that I couldn't be trusted with financial decisions, that keeping the insurance money from me was actually protecting me from myself. None of it was true, but they'd built an entire narrative around my supposed incompetence. The cruelest part was reading Quinn's descriptions of our interactions. Every time I'd called him for help, he'd described it to Monica as evidence of my neediness and poor planning. When I'd worked extra shifts to afford Christmas presents for the grandchildren, he'd told her I was being manipulative by trying to buy their affection. When I'd mentioned feeling lonely in our last phone conversation, he'd written to Monica, "She's getting clingy again. I think we need to be firmer about boundaries. Maybe if she had to manage on her own for a while, she'd develop some independence." Independence. He wanted me to be independent while systematically cutting me off from the resources that would have made that possible. I found records of conversations with their financial advisor, too. Quinn had been planning to move the insurance money into a generational trust that would benefit his children, but would never be accessible to me, even in an emergency. He'd described it as protecting the family assets from potential elder care costs and ensuring the children's future security. He was actively planning to steal my inheritance and pass it to his children, cutting me out entirely. The most damning discovery was a recent email exchange about the cabin purchase. Monica had been furious about the expense at first, until Quinn explained his strategy. The cabin serves multiple purposes. It gets her out of our immediate area so the kids don't have to deal with her neediness. It's cheap enough that it won't impact our real investments. And best of all, it makes us look generous to anyone who might ask questions later. If she ever finds out about the insurance money, we can point to the cabin and say we've been taking care of her all along. Monica's response, "Brilliant. Plus, if her health gets worse, we can always say she chose to isolate herself. No one can blame us for respecting her independence. They had it all figured out." The cabin wasn't a gift. It was evidence they could use against me later, proof of their generosity that would cover for years of theft and neglect. I printed out everything I could before the library closed, my hands shaking as I fed quarters into the copy machine. By the time I drove back to the cabin, I had a folder full of evidence that painted Quinn and Monica as calculating thieves who'd been systematically stealing from me while convincing themselves they were the victims of my neediness. That evening, I sat at the small kitchen table and really looked at my life for the first time in 15 years. I'd been living like a woman grateful for scraps, apologizing for existing, working myself into exhaustion to avoid being a burden on my millionaire son who was literally living off money that belonged to me. I thought about all the times I'd canceled doctor appointments because I couldn't afford the copays, the years I'd driven a car held together with prayer and duct tape because I couldn't afford repairs, the countless nights I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could save money for small gifts for grandchildren who'd been taught to see me as an embarrassment. Meanwhile, Quinn had been using my money to pay for private schools, luxury vacations, and a lifestyle that let him play the successful businessman while his wife looked down on his pathetic mother. The phone on the counter seemed to mock me with its silence. No calls checking on how I was settling in, no texts asking if I needed anything. Why would there be? In their minds, they'd solved the problem of Blanche by parking me in this cabin where I could quietly exist without bothering them or embarrassing them in front of people who mattered. But as I sat there surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I realized something important. I wasn't the broken, needy woman they'd convinced themselves I was. I was a 66-year-old woman who'd raised a child alone, worked multiple jobs for decades, and survived everything life had thrown at me. I was stronger than they knew, and I was about to prove it. The question wasn't whether they'd stolen from me. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was how long they'd been planning this, and what other lies they'd built their comfortable life on. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang. Quinn's name appeared on the screen. For 15 years, I would have answered immediately, grateful for any contact from my busy, successful son. Tonight, I let it ring and watched his name disappear from the screen. Then it rang again and again. Whatever had prompted Quinn to suddenly need to talk to me, it couldn't be good news. People don't call their mothers 35 times unless something has gone very, very wrong with their carefully laid plans. I smiled grimly and turned the phone off. Let him wonder. Let him worry. For once in 15 years, Quinn was going to have to wait for me. I turned my phone back on the next morning to find 47 missed calls from Quinn and 18 voicemails. The desperate urgency in his voice told me everything I needed to know about why he'd suddenly remembered he had a mother. The first few voicemails were typically Quinn, controlled, slightly annoyed that I wasn't answering. "Mom, it's me. Call me back when you get this." But by voicemail number 7, his tone had shifted entirely. "Mom, where are you? I drove by the cabin and your car wasn't there. Please call me. It's important." By number 12, "Mom, I need to talk to you right now. This is urgent. I'm worried about you." The final voicemail was barely coherent. "Mom, please, I'm begging you. Just pick up the phone. We need to talk face to face. I'm coming over." I was still listening to his messages when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I watched Quinn stride toward the cabin, his face a mask of controlled panic that I'd never seen before. Monica was with him, clutching her designer purse like armor, and looking around the modest surroundings with obvious distaste. I took my time answering the door. When I finally opened it, Quinn pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, his eyes immediately scanning the room like he was looking for something specific. "Mom, thank God. Where were you yesterday? I was worried sick." His concern would have been touching if I hadn't just read months of emails where he and Monica discussed how much longer they'd have to deal with me. I watched him pace the small living room, noting how his gaze kept darting toward the bedroom door. "I was at the library," I said calmly, "learning some new things." Monica snorted softly. The library? Blanche, you should have mentioned you were interested in books. We could have gotten you a tablet. Much more convenient. The condescension in her voice was so familiar I almost missed it. This was how she'd always spoken to me, like I was a child who needed guidance on basic life skills. But now I could hear it clearly, the way you suddenly notice a sound that's been irritating you for years. What's so urgent that you needed to call me 47 times? I asked, settling into the armchair like I had all the time in the world. Quinn stopped pacing. 47? Mom, I wanted to make sure you were settling in okay. Since when? The question hung in the air between us. Quinn's face went through several expressions before settling on hurt confusion. What do you mean? I always check on you. No, you don't. My voice was steady, matter of fact. You haven't asked how I was doing once since you dropped off those keys. You missed my birthday dinner. You haven't introduced me to your children's friends or invited me to a family gathering in over 2 years. So I'll ask again. What's urgent? Monica stepped forward, her smile sharp as a blade. Blanche, you're being dramatic. Quinn has been incredibly generous with you. This cabin alone cost $30,000. Most people would be grateful. Most people. I repeated slowly. Tell me, Monica, how much did your mother's ranch cost? Her smile faltered slightly. That's completely different. Mom needed space for her horses. And what do I need space for? Well, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Quinn cleared his throat and tried a different approach. Mom, you seem upset about something. Why don't you tell us what's bothering you? I looked at my son. This stranger wearing Quinn's face who'd been systematically stealing from me for 15 years, while convincing himself he was protecting me. The young man who'd mouthed "thank you" at his graduation had been replaced by someone who could lie to my face without flinching. I found some interesting documents, I said finally, hidden in the bedroom. Quinn went absolutely still. What kind of documents? The kind your father left for me. The kind you told me didn't exist. If I hadn't been watching closely, I would have missed it. The microscopic glance that passed between Quinn and Monica. They'd rehearsed for this moment. They had a plan. Monica was the first to speak. Oh, honey, you found those old papers? Quinn, didn't you tell her about the insurance? Quinn nodded slowly like he was thinking hard about how to explain something complicated to a confused elderly person. Mom, I did handle that for you. Remember? Right after Dad died, you were so overwhelmed. You asked me to take care of all the financial stuff. I never asked you to take care of anything. You were grieving, Monica said gently, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Quinn was just trying to protect you from additional stress. The money has been safely invested this whole time, growing for your future. My future, I repeated. And where exactly is this money now? Quinn sat down across from me, leaning forward with the earnest expression he'd perfected as a child when he was in trouble. It's in a secure investment account. I've been managing it carefully, making sure it grows. I was waiting for the right time to transition it back to you. 15 years wasn't the right time. Oh, Mom, you have to understand. That's a lot of money to manage. I wanted to make sure you were ready for that kind of responsibility. The paternalistic tone in his voice made my skin crawl. This was how he justified it to himself. I was too fragile, too incompetent, too emotional to handle my own inheritance. He was protecting me by stealing from me. And the withdrawals? I asked. The money you've been using for your house? Monica's car, the children's school. Quinn's face went pale. How do you? The internet is a wonderful thing, I said. Full of information, once you know where to look. Monica's mask slipped entirely. You've been spying on us? I've been researching what happened to my husband's life insurance policy, the one my son told me didn't exist while he was using it to fund his lifestyle. That's not what happened, Quinn said quickly. Those were loans against the policy. I was going to pay them back. With what money? And when? He couldn't answer. We all knew he'd never intended to pay anything back. Monica stood up abruptly, her purse clutched tight in her white-knuckled hands. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Quinn has been incredibly responsible with those funds. He's grown them substantially. He's grown them while I worked 3 jobs to pay for my husband's funeral, while I've been rationing my medications because I couldn't afford the copays, while I've been apologizing for needing help with basic expenses. That was your choice, Monica snapped, her compassionate mask finally discarded. No one asked you to be a martyr. The words hung in the air like poison. This was what she really thought of me, that my struggles were self-imposed drama, that my poverty was a choice I'd made to manipulate sympathy. Quinn shot his wife a warning look, but the damage was done. The truth was out. You're right, I said quietly. No one asked me to be a martyr, just like no one asked you to steal from me. We didn't steal anything. Monica's voice rose sharply. That money has been sitting there earning interest for 15 years. You're actually better off than if you'd had access to it. Better off? I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 66 years in my aching joints. I'm better off working minimum wage jobs instead of enjoying the retirement my husband planned for me. I'm better off feeling like a burden on my successful son who was literally living off my money. Quinn tried one more time. Mom, I know this looks bad, but I was trying to help. You have to believe that. I looked at him for a long moment, searching for some trace of the little boy who used to hug me tight and promise he'd take care of me when I got old. But that child was gone, replaced by a man who could steal from his own mother and convince himself he was being noble. I believe you convinced yourself you were helping, I said finally. Just like you convinced yourself I was too incompetent to handle my own affairs. Just like you convinced yourself that keeping me poor was protecting me. That's not... Get out! The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Quinn blinked. Mom, get out of my house, both of you. Monica opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. You've stolen 15 years of my life. You've kept me from my grandchildren because you were ashamed of my poverty. Poverty you created. You've lied to me, manipulated me, and convinced an entire family that I was some kind of invalid who needed protection from my own money. I walked to the door and opened it. I said, get out. They left, but Quinn turned back at the threshold. Mom, we need to work this out, as a family. I looked at him for what felt like the last time. We stopped being family the day you decided I was too stupid to handle my own husband's final gift to me. After they drove away, I sat in my armchair and felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years. Freedom. The phone started ringing again almost immediately, but this time I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. The next morning, I drove to the law office of Margaret Chen, an elder law attorney whose name I'd found through careful research. Her office was modest but professional, and she listened to my story with the kind of focused attention I hadn't received from anyone in years. Mrs. Patterson, she said after reviewing the documents I'd brought, what your son did constitutes financial elder abuse, potentially fraud, and definitely breach of fiduciary duty. The signature on this power of attorney document appears to have been forged, and even if it wasn't, he exceeded his authority the moment he began using your funds for personal expenses. I sat across from her desk, feeling oddly calm for someone whose life had been built on lies for 15 years. What are my options? Several. We can demand immediate return of all funds with interest. We can file criminal charges for fraud and theft. We can pursue civil remedies for damages beyond just the money, compensation for the years of hardship you endured because of his actions. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But I have to warn you, pursuing this will likely destroy your relationship with your son permanently. Families rarely recover from this kind of legal action. What relationship? I asked. The one where I apologize for existing while he steals my inheritance? The one where I'm kept away from my grandchildren because I'm an embarrassment? That relationship was destroyed 15 years ago. I just didn't know it yet. Margaret nodded. Then let's discuss strategy. We spent 2 hours going through everything. The forged signature alone was enough for criminal charges. But the pattern of systematic theft over 15 years painted a picture of calculated abuse that went far beyond simple financial misconduct. Quinn had isolated me, controlled me, and stolen from me while convincing himself and others that he was protecting me. There's something else, Margaret said as our meeting wound down. The money your son has been using. We can trace every penny of it. His house, his wife's car, the children's school tuition, their vacations, even their grocery bills. All of it funded with money that legally belongs to you. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Everything? Everything. Your son hasn't been supporting his family through his business success. He's been supporting them with your husband's life insurance policy. In legal terms, they've been living on stolen money for over a decade. I thought about Monica's designer clothes, the children's private school, the family trips to Europe I'd seen posted on social media. All of it paid for with money that should have been securing my retirement, giving me dignity in my golden years. What happens to them when we file suit? Margaret's expression was carefully neutral. The court will likely freeze the accounts immediately. They'll have to return everything that can be liquidated. The house might have to be sold, the cars repossessed. The children will probably have to change schools. Your son's business, if it's been propped up with your money, may collapse. I should have felt guilty about that. The old Blanche would have worried about the grandchildren, would have found a way to blame herself for the disruption to their lives. But I wasn't the old Blanche anymore. And criminal charges? Financial elder abuse is a felony in this state. If convicted, your son could face significant prison time. I drove home in silence, the weight of my decision settling over me like snow. By the time I reached the cabin, I knew what I had to do. That afternoon, I signed the papers authorizing Margaret to file both criminal and civil charges against Quinn. I provided her with copies of every document I'd found, every email I'd printed, every piece of evidence that showed the systematic theft and manipulation I'd endured. This will take time to work through the courts, she warned me. Your son will likely try to contact you to pressure you into dropping the charges. He may send other family members to guilt you into backing down. He can try, I said. But Quinn's response came faster than either of us expected. The next morning, I woke to the sound of pounding on my door. Through the window, I saw Quinn's car in the driveway, but this time he wasn't alone. Monica was there, along with 2 people I didn't immediately recognize. An older man in an expensive suit and a woman with a briefcase. "Mom!" Quinn's voice was desperate through the door. "Please, we need to talk. I brought my lawyer. We can work this out." I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Quinn looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. Monica stood behind him, her face a mask of barely contained rage. The lawyer stepped forward with the practiced smile of someone used to cleaning up other people's messes. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm David Whitmore, Quinn's attorney. I understand there's been a misunderstanding about some financial matters. Perhaps we could discuss this civilly, as family?" "There's no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "Your client stole my husband's life insurance money and has been using it to fund his lifestyle for 15 years while keeping me in poverty." The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geriatric psychiatrist. Your son is concerned about your mental state. These accusations you're making don't align with your previous behavior patterns. Perhaps we should have you evaluated." "You want to have me declared incompetent," I finished. How convenient. Quinn's face crumpled. Mom, no, that's not. I just think you might be confused. This is so unlike you. The stress of moving, living alone, maybe some early cognitive issues. I'm not confused, Quinn. I'm clear-headed for the first time in 15 years. The lawyer tried again. Mrs. Patterson, litigation is expensive and traumatic for families. Perhaps we could arrange for the gradual return of the funds over time, along with a comfortable monthly allowance that would ensure your security, while Quinn keeps the bulk of my money? While we work out an arrangement that protects everyone's interests, Monica finally spoke, her voice shaking with fury. You selfish, vindictive old woman. Do you have any idea what you're doing to our children? Emma has friends at that school. Tyler is on the baseball team. You want to destroy their lives over money? The accusation might have worked on the old Blanche, but I'd spent too many nights reading emails where Monica called me pathetic, too many years apologizing for needing help with bills while she spent my inheritance on luxury items. I want my money back, I said simply. The money my husband left for my security, not your children's private school tuition. Those children are your grandchildren, Monica snapped. Don't you care about them at all? I care about them enough to want them to learn that stealing has consequences. Quinn tried a different approach. Mom, if you go through with this, you'll never see them again. Monica and I won't let you near our family after what you're putting us through. The threat hung in the air between us. For 15 years, the fear of losing Quinn and the grandchildren had kept me compliant, grateful for scraps, willing to accept whatever treatment they deemed appropriate. But I'd already lost them. I just hadn't admitted it to myself. I haven't seen them anyway, I said. You've made sure of that. The psychiatrist tried once more. Mrs. Patterson, sometimes in our golden years, we can become suspicious of those closest to us. It's not uncommon for elderly people to imagine conspiracies. Get off my property. They all started talking at once, but I'd heard enough. 15 years of gaslighting, of being told I was too emotional, too unstable, too incompetent to handle my own life. Now they wanted to have me declared mentally incompetent, so Quinn could legally keep stealing from me. Get off my property, I repeated, or I'll call the sheriff. They left, but I could hear Quinn's voice carrying across the yard as they got into their cars. She's lost her mind. We need to act fast before she does something really destructive. That evening, Margaret called with an update. Your son's attorney contacted me. They want to negotiate. What kind of negotiation? They're offering to return 60% of the original insurance money, plus they'll pay for your living expenses here at the cabin for the rest of your life. In exchange, you drop all charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I almost laughed. Even now, even caught red-handed, they wanted to control me. They'd keep 40% of my money and chain me to this cabin like some shameful family secret they could forget about. What did you tell them? I told them we'd consider it if they returned 100% of the funds plus 15 years of compounded interest, plus damages for financial elder abuse. I also told them the criminal charges aren't negotiable. And their response? They hung up on me. That night, I sat on the small porch of the cabin, listening to the wind through the pine trees and feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Not the hollow kind I'd been pretending to feel, but real peace that came from finally telling the truth and refusing to be ashamed of it. My phone had been ringing all day. Quinn, Monica, numbers I didn't recognize that were probably other family members being recruited to pressure me. I'd stopped answering hours ago. Tomorrow, Margaret would file the paperwork that would change everything. There would be headlines in the local paper, whispers in the community, family members choosing sides. Quinn and Monica's comfortable life would collapse like a house of cards built on stolen money. I should have felt guilty about the grandchildren, about the disruption to their lives, but as I sat there in the growing darkness, I realized that the best thing I could do for them was teach them that actions have consequences, that you can't build happiness on someone else's suffering. The old Blanche would have backed down by now, would have found a way to blame herself and protect Quinn from the consequences of his choices. but she was gone, buried under 15 years of manipulation and lies. The woman who remained was stronger than anyone suspected, and she was just getting started. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a comfortable ranch house with a garden I'd dreamed of for 20 years, preparing dinner for people who actually wanted to spend time with me. The sound of laughter drifted in from the living room where my new friend Helen was showing photos from our recent trip to Ireland to my neighbor Dorothy and her granddaughter. Ireland. I'd always wanted to go, had talked about it with Robert before he died. Quinn used to roll his eyes when I mentioned it, saying I should be more realistic about my financial limitations. Now I knew he was spending my money on family trips to Europe while telling me I couldn't afford a vacation. The doorbell rang, and I smiled as I dried my hands on my apron. That would be Margaret, my lawyer who'd become one of my closest friends over these past months. She'd insisted on bringing dessert to tonight's celebration dinner. As I walked to the door, I passed the framed newspaper article on my hall table. Local woman recovers $1.2 million in elder abuse case. The photo showed me standing in front of the courthouse, not smiling, but looking determined and dignified. I kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what I'd survived. The criminal case had concluded last week. Quinn pleaded guilty to financial elder abuse and fraud to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. He received 2 years in county jail, 5 years probation, and was ordered to make full restitution. The civil case had been resolved months earlier. I recovered not just the original $450,000 in life insurance money, but 15 years of compound interest and additional damages for the financial hardship I'd endured. Margaret came in carrying a homemade apple pie, her face bright with satisfaction. "How are you feeling about everything?" "Free," I said simply. And I was. For the first time in 15 years, I woke up each morning without the weight of financial anxiety pressing down on me. I could afford my medications, my doctor visits, even small luxuries like fresh flowers for the dining room table. I'd bought a reliable car, taken art classes, joined a book club. I was living the life Robert had wanted for me when he bought that insurance policy. The house had been my first major purchase after the settlement. Nothing ostentatious, but comfortable and mine. The garden was already flourishing under my care. Tomatoes, herbs, flowers that I tended each morning with coffee in hand, no longer rushing off to some minimum wage job that barely covered my expenses. "Any word from Quinn?" Margaret asked as we joined the others in the living room. I shook my head. Quinn was serving his sentence at the county facility, but I hadn't visited him. Monica had divorced him 3 months ago, taking the children and moving back to her mother's ranch in another state. She'd managed to keep some assets by claiming she hadn't known about the fraud, though the emails I'd found suggested otherwise. The grandchildren I'd barely been allowed to know were gone from my life entirely, but I'd made peace with that. They were Monica's ammunition now, just as my poverty had been Quinn's excuse for keeping me at arm's length. Some battles weren't worth fighting. "I heard through other channels that he's been asking to see you," Margaret continued gently. "Let him ask." My friend Helen looked up from her photos. "You don't feel any obligation to visit him? He is still your son." It was a fair question, one I'd wrestled with during the long nights when the guilt tried to creep back in. "The Quinn I raised died somewhere along the way," I said finally. "The man in that jail cell is a stranger who stole from me for 15 years while convincing himself he was protecting me." Dorothy nodded approvingly. She was 82 and had raised 6 children alone after her husband left. "Some people mistake kindness for weakness," she said. "Sounds like your boy learned too late that his mother was stronger than he thought." We spent the evening looking at photos from my Ireland trip, planning the cruise to Alaska that Helen and I had booked for next spring, and talking about the art class I'd signed up for at the community college. Simple pleasures that had been impossible when I was working multiple jobs, just to survive on what Quinn deemed an appropriate income for his embarrassing mother. After everyone left, I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and looked around my living room. Family photos lined the mantel, but they were different now. Pictures of Robert and me from our early marriage, photos with friends I'd made in recent months, snapshots from my travels. The shrine to Quinn's accomplishments that had dominated my old apartment was gone, replaced by evidence of my own life. The phone rang, and for a moment my heart jumped with old anxiety. But it was just Helen, calling to thank me for dinner and confirm our plans for tomorrow's farmer's market visit. "You know," she said before hanging up, "I'm so glad we met in that art class. You've become such a dear friend. A friend. Not someone who tolerated me out of obligation or guilt, but someone who genuinely enjoyed my company." It had taken me 66 years to learn the difference. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the woman who'd stood in that cabin 6 months ago, devastated by the difference between a $30,000 cabin and a $200,000 ranch. She'd felt worthless, disposable, grateful for scraps of attention from a son who saw her as an embarrassment. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was tending my tomatoes when a car pulled into my driveway. A young woman got out, maybe mid-20s, with Quinn's eyes and Monica's stubborn chin. It took me a moment to recognize Emma, my granddaughter, now grown up and beautiful. "Grandma Blanche?" Her voice was uncertain, nervous. I set down my watering can and really looked at her. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, not the designer clothes I remembered from old photos. Her car was modest, practical. Whatever comfortable life Quinn had built on my money was clearly over. "Emma," I didn't rush to hug her, didn't gush with grandmotherly enthusiasm. Too much had happened for easy reconciliation. I wanted to see you, to talk to you." She glanced around at my house, my garden, the life I'd built. "This is nice. Thank you." We stood in awkward silence for a moment before she continued. "Mom told me what happened, about Dad and the money and everything." Her voice was small, young despite her age. "I didn't know about any of it." "I figured you didn't. She's been saying you're vindictive, that you destroyed our family over money." Emma looked directly at me, searching my face. "But that's not what the newspaper article said. That's not what the court records show." Smart girl. She'd done her own research instead of just accepting her mother's version of events. "What do you think?" I asked. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring at my tomato plants. "I think Dad lied to a lot of people for a very long time. I think maybe we were living a lie and just didn't know it. And now you do know." She nodded, tears threatening. "Everything's gone. The house, my school, Tyler's baseball team. Mom acts like it's all your fault, but..." She took a shaky breath. "If Dad hadn't taken your money, none of this would have happened, right?" "Right. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry we barely knew you. I'm sorry Dad kept us away from you. I'm sorry about everything." I studied my granddaughter's face, seeing genuine remorse there, not the manipulative performance I'd learned to recognize from her parents. "What do you want from me, Emma?" "I don't want anything," she said quickly. I wanted you to know that not all of us believed the lies. And I wanted to see if maybe I could get to know my grandmother. The real one. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion. But it was honest, which was more than I'd gotten from anyone in the family for 15 years. "Would you like some iced tea?" I asked. We spent the afternoon talking on my back porch. Emma told me about college, about working part-time to help pay for her expenses now that the family money was gone. She asked about Robert, about my childhood, about the person I'd been before I became the convenient victim of Quinn's manipulation. When she left, she didn't ask for money or make promises about staying in touch. She just hugged me, carefully, respectfully, and said, "Thank you for not giving up on yourself." That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the trees I'd planted myself. The phone didn't ring with desperate calls from Quinn. My mailbox didn't hold bills I couldn't afford to pay. My calendar was full of activities I'd chosen, trips I was planning, art classes and book club meetings and dinners with friends who valued my company. Robert's life insurance money was doing exactly what he'd intended, giving me security, dignity, and the freedom to live fully. Not supporting a son who'd learned to see his mother as an ATM to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I pulled out my phone and looked at Margaret's last text. Quinn's attorney called again. He wants to arrange a meeting when he gets out. Still no? I typed back a single word. No. Then I deleted Quinn's contact information from my phone entirely. Some relationships can't be repaired. Some trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt. But that doesn't mean you can't build something new. I was 66 years old, and for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. Free, dignified, and finally living the life I deserved. The woman who'd accepted scraps and apologized for existing was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth and refused to settle for less. It had taken me 66 years to learn that lesson, but better late than never. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.